Welcome to Order from Ashes. I'm Thanasi Kambanis, Director of Century International. Today we're going to do something a little different on the podcast. I'm going to talk to two of our fellows who are based in the region that's at war, and we're going to get their read on the strategic direction of the conflict that's underway. We're recording on Sunday, March 15th, and I'll be talking to Century International fellow Sam Heller, who's in Beirut. And after that, I'll be talking to Century International fellow Dahlia Scheindlin, who's in Tel Aviv. I'm going to be asking them a little bit about the latest news, but mostly I'm going to be asking them about how they read the strategic direction of the war that's underway, where it might go, and what we should be looking for in the week to come as we assess the human toll and also the possibility that I hope for the conflict to end, and also the outcome that I fear, which is that it lapses into a kind of new cycle of endless forever war. So first, we're going to turn to my conversation with Sam Heller that I recorded earlier on Sunday. And after that, my conversation with Dahlia Scheindlin. First, we hear from Sam. I've got Sam Heller on the line with me from Beirut. Sam, thanks so much for coming on Order from Ashes.
Hi, good to check in again.
So it's Sunday, May 5th, March, not May. It's Sunday, March 14th, March 15th while we're talking. And today we're going to check in a little bit with the sort of strategic view of the situation from Beirut, where you are. And although I want to talk a little bit about some of the latest news, I want to frame the conversation in a way that sort of stays useful for our listeners over the course of the week to come as they watch events unfolding. So I guess to start with, can you tell us your take on these reports of incipient peace talks between the Lebanese government and Israel? How serious is this?
Oh yeah, I'm pretty skeptical of that. I mean, not that these overtures aren't being made, but of their, real prospects.
Are they being
Uh,
made by Lebanese, or are they Israeli initiated and Lebanon is sort of doing the minimum formalities to respond?
no, I mean these are they're initiatives by Lebanon's leadership, by Prime Minister Nawaf Salam and Joseph Aoun. I think. I mean, Aoun is the one who, has really advanced a new proposal for direct negotiations with the Israelis. But I mean, he floated this in a like a virtual summit this past week, and so I read the portion
The
of the
transcript
trans.
of the remarks that he shared, I think, from the presidential X handle,
Yeah,
right?
and then like if you read it, then immediately before this, he says he's like, yeah, I had previously proposed this other initiative for negotiations and talks, and then there was no response from the Israeli side. So here's now my new initiative, which it sounds like has also not really been met with like a lot of enthusiasm by either the Israelis or the Americans.
And
Um,
and to situate, I mean, the context. I mean, you're there. You're there on the ground. From here, following the news, it seems like this is even worse than the previously pretty horrific rounds of uh, sort of area bombing by Israel of Lebanon. And I mean, the specific things that leap to mind as indicating a sort of worsening change of state are these plans that I've seen leaked by Israel to once again like establish an occupation zone in South Lebanon all the way up to the Litani, the dropping of flyers on Beirut, and again from reports, it seems like even more so than in previous, in the last major round of Israeli bombing. This time, they're not even giving specific targeted warnings to people to leave their buildings. That they're just sort of giving general warnings about entire neighborhoods or towns or geographies, and then bombing relatively indiscriminately within those areas. So that's the sense I get from here. How accurately does that capture the sense of like totality and engulfing of this war, and how does that change the dynamics for Lebanon in terms of, you know, support for Hezbollah or support for the government's peace overtures or deepening sectarian divides.
Uh, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Like this, the things that I mean, the sense that this may be different for, people who are kind of situated otherwise. I mean, maybe I'm not sure. It may feel like there's more of a step change in the South. I mean, from where I'm at, it seems like there's a lot of continuity between what's been going on now. I mean, the Israeli campaign to date, at least. I mean, there are these reports about like a large forthcoming escalation, in this like massive ground incursion. But so far, I mean, it's in key respects, it's like they just kind of picked up where they left off in October, November 2024. Um, I mean, the blanket evacuation orders that they've issued for like Beirut southern suburbs, for large sections of the south. I don't know if that's meaningfully worse than like some of the more specific warnings that they would broadcast previously in the last war. In part because I think that, I mean, those warnings before were not, I think, they were not basically humanitarian, right? I mean, like that was not a matter of, you know, it was not, the point was not to save lives, right? I
Right.
think that when the Israelis, when they
These seemed like they were designed to like terrify the population and uh, sort of in vain try and turn people against Hezbollah as opposed to their actual reaction, which is to be enraged at Israel for what it's doing.
It's a psychological warfare thing, right? I mean, because they notify you that they're going to like pancake this given building on, a some purported basis, like a claimed link with Hezbollah, maybe, or I have no way of like evaluating the veracity of that. But, they tell you they're going to do it, and then they flatten the building, and there's nothing you can do, right? So I think it's about like communicating your basic kind of passivity, right? I mean, your inability to stop the like Israeli war machine.
Mhm.
Um, so they've done less of that. I mean, or less, yeah, they've done less of that type of kind of psychological work this time. I mean, they did some of it on Thursday, right? So they hit several buildings that were pretty close to my apartment.
And is
And
this
then
the night where they struck the Ramlet al Beida, the people who were camping on the waterfront to get away from southern Beirut?
so I think this was the day following. I think it was the day following the Ramat al Beta strike. I mean, the thing is, like my whole whatever, my sense of time is, you
Well,
know,
well, I mean,
it was the remember.
let's
So
let's
Hezbollah
try
sent
and
this
take
kind of
a
massive multi-hundred missile barrage into Israel, and then
Mhm.
Israelis, escalated in
Right.
response. They dropped bombs on this high rise in Bashura. In Bashura, and then I guess what they called al-Blat, but I mean,
These
you
are
might.
neighborhoods in central Beirut that in past conflicts have remained off limits. So let's pull back
The
a little
Israelis
bit.
hit them a couple times in the last war in 2024, but it still makes an impression because I mean, first, some of the munitions that they used on the Bashura strike near my house were like pretty heavy duty. I guess there was you could see people cut video of like a 1,000-pound bomb dropping in, and then it's very close to the parliament. It's very close to like where the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres was staying. So it is in the heart of things, right? So I think it made it was to make a point,
So
and then they claim they were hitting some financial infrastructure. It's like seems maybe bullshit.
how is this playing out for Lebanon as a sort of internal politics. I mean, so some of the key uh, data points to make sense of, the president, as you mentioned earlier, Joseph Aoun, has been interfacing a lot with Western leaders and has at least rhetorically said he's willing to engage in peace talks. The president and the prime minister have more or less accused Hezbollah of treason for starting this phase of the war. And in response, several Hezbollah supporters have accused the government of being treasonous for being, for sort of selling out the resistance and being willing to make peace with Israel. And that level of rhetoric is something I don't think I've seen outright in a quarter century. This and why does that matter? It matters because of the history of civil strife and the level of the like this is a combustible situation in which Hezbollah on the one hand and some of these factions that back the government on the other end could end up falling back into a full-on civil conflict. So that's that's question in my mind is what if any are the risks of this this renewed level of Israeli attack triggering an internal war between Lebanese?
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, it seems that antipathy to Hezbollah has reached a high point, right? I mean and then there are some, unprecedented steps, initiatives being undertaken by the president, the prime minister, um, and at least some portion of Hezbollah's kind of base constituency who are unhappy, right? I mean, who are really suffering, and then who reproach Hezbollah for subjecting them to this, or also for like as they see it, kind of initiating this war in response to the killing of Iran's Ali Khamenei, as opposed to at any point over the previous year and 3 months when Israel was striking southern eastern Lebanon on a daily basis. Um,
So to
Same
put a
time,
not a fine point on it, they were revealing that they're much more willing to go to the mat for Iran than they are for their fellow Lebanese.
that is how I think some people see it. Like I don't know. I think that there are legitimate alternative explanations for why Hezbollah opted to engage now, right? I mean, if we whatever, this is a little bit of a detour, but I mean, if we assume that, now for like a year plus they were preparing for this next confrontation and that they were getting ready for it, I think they could have, in addition to like the symbolic significance of Khamenei's death, I think they could fairly assess that, like, oh, this moment of, open regional conflict, with Israel preoccupied on the Iran front, uh, and with what seemed like an imminent Israeli campaign targeting Lebanon, right? As soon as it was done with Iran, I think they could fairly look at this and be like, okay, now is the moment, right? That like we've been building this capability, let's use it. Um, let's see. So back to yeah, right. So back to kind of domestic Lebanese opposition to Hezbollah. I don't know. I mean, I think that it could bleed into kind of more uh, like grassroots social tension and conflict, right? Including like between displaced people, between displaced people and host communities. I mean, many people. I mean, some host communities. I think. I mean, there's some degree of kind of sectarian, you know, racism, bigotry at work, but I think also people who blame Hezbollah and the Shiites for kind of inviting this on the country. People who are legitimately, I think, afraid that that the arrival of displaced people will somehow invite Israeli airstrikes. Obviously the Israelis have repeatedly targeted displaced Lebanese across the country. So you could have stuff bubble up that way. I don't think it's likely though that I mean I don't think it's likely that there will be any sort of major confrontation between the army, the other forces of the state, and Hezbollah. Um, I think that, there might be some outside countries that would like to push things in that direction, but, all indications are that President Aoun, who himself was the head of the Lebanese army, and then the current army commander, Rudolf Heikel, we understand that pitting the army against like a core component of the Lebanese people, like this Lebanese constituency, especially, as the country is under attack by Israel, right? As that constituency is fighting to defend the country, that would be, I think, it would be disastrous for the country's internal social fabric, likely for the cohesion
So
of military, which I think many people, assume would crack up.
so that, I mean, that analysis lends itself towards a extension of the status quo in which the Lebanese government, the Lebanese state, would like to disarm Hezbollah, but knows it can't. So it will sort of make, it'll take positions that are pro integrating Hezbollah into the armed forces or ending its independent ability to act, but no, ability to actually do so. And in which Hezbollah will also maybe, um, you know, keep to a minimum its direct attacks on instruments of the state. And it seems like, I mean, that's been more or less the dynamic on and off for years. And it seems like Israel has decided that it's just not going to tolerate that anymore. And in a way had already shown that during the supposed ceasefire, during which it essentially continued a low-grade warfare level of attacks against Lebanon and Lebanese infrastructure, and by the way, was unable to stop Hezbollah from reestablishing or maintaining its ability to fire rockets into Israel. So that raises for me a couple of interesting questions, and one is, what, like, are we just set up for an ongoing status quo in which Israel is more or less constantly or cyclically attacking Lebanon, and successfully, like, harming Lebanese life for millions of people, but failing to actually achieve any of its strategic aims of limiting Hezbollah, and in which Lebanese factions will essentially maintain their predatory approach to the population, and so never acquire the powers of the state, but also never stop sort of cannibalizing each other. Did you understand the question in that long, you know,
Well,
set
I
of
mean,
words?
I think that, uh, yeah, no, I mostly followed. Uh, no, I think that, no, I mean, I think
We're in
that,
trouble if you can't follow me after all these years. Then I'm lost.
I think that friends, uh, I think that, I mean, no, I think that, Israel's sense that, that these proposals, that these initiatives put forward by Lebanon's political leadership are basically unserious, right? That, I mean, that's what informs, Israel's so far, like, lack of receptivity to, some of these appeals for talks, and its insistence on, continuing to target Hezbollah. I mean, first, during the ostensible ceasefire, and then, now kind of in like a much more dynamic, uh, destructive way. Um, because, I mean, it seems that I think, understandably from their side, it seems that they don't trust, they have no confidence in the institutions of the Lebanese state to meaningfully constrain or to neutralize Hezbollah for them, right? So they will do it. I think that's their outlook. Um, and I think that even, I mean, at least my current sense, or my best guess at the kind of Israeli outlook. I mean, what they would like to see is, I think that they would genuinely like to have kind of normal, uh, neighborly political relations with the Lebanese government, but while also continuing to prosecute kind of like an anti-Hezbollah campaign themselves,
So like
right?
they would like to bomb Hezbollah areas and also have state-to-state relationships with Lebanese National Authority,
I think so. Yeah. I mean, so that's why, I mean,
which
which
is
is why,
like what they're trying to set up with Syria as well, right? I mean, that is a blueprint. It's
I
questionable
mean, I've
whether
heard
they'll succeed.
people have compared it to the West. I've heard people compare it to the West Bank, right? Yeah, which is why a kind
You
of
mean have like a
Lebanese,
Lebanese government that's like the Palestinian Authority was?
yeah, I mean that's the analogy that I've heard. Um, not something that I've heard from, that I've like the a comparison I've heard the Israelis make, but definitely, kind of observers who've tried to make sense of the like Israeli intentions. Um, I mean, but that's why kind of Lebanese proposals that would somehow, for kind of direct talks, for recognition, for normal relations that would entail Israel's withdrawal from the country and then would meaningfully, would substantively constrain Israel. It seemed to me, seemed for the Israelis to be a non-starter, right? Because like they want to continue to prosecute this campaign.
Well,
Um,
and the stumbling block I run into when I think through like a non-terrible scenario for Lebanon, it requires a stronger Lebanese state than I can imagine actually coming into existence. Like any scenario that's halfway decent for Lebanon requires a Lebanese army and a Lebanese government that has much more buy-in from the Shia population than the current government does, and that has far more power to deliver services and actually secure borders and, frankly, to deter foreign attacks. And I just don't see any of those powers coming to pass for the Lebanese state. Not least because Israel and the United States don't want that to happen, right? When the rubber meets the road of building state capacity, the number one obstacle is that the power, like the United States does not want to give weapons to the Lebanese military that it could actually use effectively against Israel. So it's a,
I mean, this
the yeah, go ahead.
logic, I mean, this is the logic of, Hezbollah as this like parallel non-state apparatus, right? Is because like the Lebanese state is like so penetrated and compromised and beholden to these various, donors, and then like that, if you believe in the necessity of an armed force that is opposed to Israel, that can kind of credibly resist, then it can only exist outside the state, right? Like it has to be kind of air gapped.
I mean,
In
in the states that Israel has an official peace with, Jordan and Egypt, those states, I mean, we can argue about how genuinely viable the armies of those states are, but they have real militaries that have like deterrent power, right? Israel, I don't think could invade and take over Jordan or Egypt without a batting an eyelash. Now they've been okay with that because they have these sort of durable peace treaties with the state. But you have to somehow that happened in those two cases, right? So it's
I mean, I think there's a degree of path dependence at work here, right? So like, I mean, some of the Jordanian Egyptian outcomes I think are, in the year of our Lord 2026, right? They are not available to Lebanon, right? After the decades and decades of enmity, of conflict, and then I mean, war with, I mean, conflict with PLO, with various other factions over the latter part of the 20th century into the 21st. So I mean, you can't really start from zero. Uh, I do think, I mean, but I'm not a Jordan or an Egypt expert. I mean, but I mean, my impression has been that, I mean, that those militaries are, that they exist, that they have real capabilities, but I mean that they are that those countries have, in some respects at least, that they have kind of reduced or sacrificed elements of sovereignty in the service of peace with Israel, and that like they don't, even if even as like those militaries would not be total pushovers, right? I mean, they're not nothing, but like I don't think that they would that they would uh, that they would be a match for the Israeli military. But then, they've established like a relationship, a dynamic with the Israelis in which like that is not the kind of governing logic, right? It's not for them, it's not about deterring an attack by Israel. They've become enmeshed in all these other kind of political economic arrangements that militate against conflict.
So let's move this. I mean, we're going to be talking again in the weeks to come, so we don't have to cover all the ground. But I guess the last question I'll ask you to riff on is, as our listeners follow whatever crazy things happen in the coming week, the third full week of this war. What would you suggest people focus on and watch when they think about the question of what's going to happen over the long term for Lebanon?
So I think that what will be dispositive, right? I mean, what is, going to decide things will be the military outcome, right? And then it's like whether, Hezbollah kind of working in tandem with Iran, uh, and with an Iran that is potentially, we'll see, the Iran's willingness to maybe to disengage, to ceasefire, either independently or whether they would agree to do that without also securing some sort of uh, like resolution for Lebanon too. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's the military side of this that I think will decide the outcome. And I
And
think
that's the military side from sort of the key ingredients being what Israel does, what Iran does, Hezbollah in the US, or is it really everyone that we need to be factoring in as we think about this?
I think those are the key players here. And then I think also, I mean, that's why, I mean, that my assumption is that that's why Hezbollah is probably less concerned with kind of with rising domestic Lebanese opposition, criticism of the party, is because they figure that that for them, like this fight is existential, and that they will be judged on the military outcome, right? So either they will succeed or they will fail. And then if they will succeed, then I think that kind of the country's politics will likely kind of organize around that, right? Will reshape to fit that. And if they don't, then they will be like substantially diminished militarily, politically. Um, I think, I mean, it looks like the Israelis right now. I mean, we have to. The Israelis are now briefing on like a forthcoming invasion of the South. Um, So I think that the Israelis seem like they are motivated to revise the status quo, right? I mean they are pushing for something dramatic, and then so we will see how kind of Hezbollah's, I mean the capabilities that they've rebuilt that they've accumulated over the past, I mean, decades, but in the past like year plus. Uh, their like theory of victory here. I mean, we'll see that tested. Um, and
I
then
mean,
I
it
think
seems
a lot of
it's
the stuff about like kind of negotiations, et cetera, I think is just kind of noise,
not
right?
not important. So
That's like a
right,
side.
so if and I mean, I think that's a compelling framing, and I guess I'll leave you with this last question. I mean, are like one of the thoughts I had this week as I was immersed in this sort of flood of aw- in my view, like just awful developments and really awful escalations by the US and Israel. One of the thoughts I had is like, holy crap, is this like the early 80s? And are we on the eve of the US backing Israel as Israel goes in and tries to occupy a big chunk of Lebanon and install an Israel friendly government in Lebanon, which, like aside from the many first order reasons why it's like a terrible and wrong thing to do, it's also something that obviously can't work. uh so it's like, you know it's wrong, it's immoral, it's going to kill a lot of people, it's going to destabilize the region, it's going to have all these like uh unforeseeable but sort of guaranteed bad second and third order consequences. Also, it's not going to produce its own intended result on its own terms. And yet, it seems like it's on the table again, which I find astonishing and also somehow maybe predictable given the normalization of crazy talk in Washington and Tel Aviv over the last couple of years.
Yeah, no, I mean it sounds like, that the Israelis may attempt a version of that. And then everything I've seen reported, at least, about the US position so far is that that they are just entirely supportive of Israeli intentions, right?
Jeez.
They're just behind whatever the Israelis view as appropriate. Um, so yeah,
Well,
I mean,
I
I don't know.
guess watch this space. Hopefully our listeners find this a helpful guide as they digest this sort of torrent of developments in the coming weeks. And I guess in a week or two we'll check in with you again on the podcast.
Cool. Thanks for having me on.
I've been talking to Sam Heller in Beirut. I'm Thanasi Kambanis. And after the break, we're going to turn to another Century International Fellow, Dahlia Scheindlin, who's based in Tel Aviv. And we'll turn to that conversation after a couple of musical seconds. I'm now joined by Dahlia Scheindlin, our fellow in Tel Aviv, who was delayed coming to this call by a what was it, a bomb alert, a air
Incoming
raid
missile barrage.
incoming missile barrage. So I'm glad you're okay and able to join us. We're talking on Sunday, March 15th, afternoon Tel Aviv time, morning New York time. Dahlia, thanks for coming on Order from Ashes.
Thank you for having me as always.
So on today's episode, we're trying to get a couple of perspectives from the region that can help us here in the U.S. understand how people are viewing what's happening and also like what the possible trajectories of this are. And I guess I want to start. I know you've been writing about this and tracking it very carefully. What is the public view in Israel? Why is support for this war so strong, and how do people in terms of public opinion view the desirability of this war, the goals of this war? Like what do they want from this?
Well, one of the interesting things is that polls that were taken before this war, and I mean in the weeks and months leading up to it, when there was a lot of kind of psychological groundwork being laid by the leadership about the need to have another war in Iran, polls were showing that a majority or a plurality of Israelis supported military action against Iran, but it was much more tepid. We were talking about moderate majorities or, bare pluralities. There was always two-thirds or so who supported America taking on Iran militarily. But Israelis had more mixed feelings about Israel, even though, again, it was a majority, just not a huge majority. And that's very much driven by the fear, because in polls that would ask directly about how afraid you are, about two-thirds of Israelis said they were very fearful. Having said that, the moment this war broke out, within a few days, pollsters began asking about support. And support is frankly something like a consensus among Jewish Israeli citizens. We're talking about 93% in the Israel Democracy Institute polling from the first week of the war, and exactly the same, no change among the Jewish population in the second week of the war, with significantly high opposition, a strong majority, about 65% of the Arab or Palestinian citizens of Israel who oppose the war. Um, the only change that I've seen over time between that first and second week of polling, particularly in the Israel Democracy Institute polls, is that the intensity of support among the Jewish population declined by a few points. I think about 6 or 7 points. And so that maybe says something about people already feeling the effects of living, under constant missile barrages and, fear and disruption to their lives and their jobs. But when
So
you're asking about why, that's more complicated, although it's not that complicated. Israelis have been told for decades that Iran is practically the only and biggest threat to Israel in the Middle East, driving all other threats. And the sort of tripartite threat of the nuclear program, ballistic missile program, and Iran's proxy network has been something that Israelis have been, aware of and coping with, and of course directly affected by the attacks of those proxies on Israel from October 7th and immediately afterwards, with Hezbollah and Houthis joining that. And so Israelis generally suppress any sort of Palestinian factor in things like the threat that Hamas poses, and instead deflect everything into, well, if Iran was somehow taken care of, all those other threats might not be so bad. Now, I think the other major factor is that Israelis have been told by Prime Minister Netanyahu over the years that there is no way to deal with any of those threats, particularly Iran, through diplomacy. There is only a military option. And I think when we look at that very high level of consensus support among Israeli Jews, it's because they have come to believe that there is no other way to cope with Iran other than through military means. And you'll hear people say it has to be done, or it had to be done.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fascinating and important. And of course, my perspective and I think our institutional perspective is that these are conflicts that can only be solved through political and diplomatic outcomes long term. And I think it's a real sort of parameter of why we're sort of set up for forever conflicts, that both the Israeli government and the Israeli public opinion have embraced this conclusion that essentially the entire array of regional relationships can only be managed by open-ended cycle of warfare. And before we move on to some other dimensions I want to ask you about, is this public opinion essentially immune? Like, is it not affected by periods of calm or the periods of risk? Is it essentially stable whether or not Israel is at a sort of position of truce with its neighbors or with Iran, or under rocket fire? Is it basically whatever happens, it reinforces the view that war is necessary among Jewish
That is a
Israelis?
very interesting question, because it just so happens that yesterday I was going through some files and I found a screenshot I had taken of a poll that was commissioned by one of the daily papers here in 2018, shortly after then President Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, and it was asking Israelis if they support a military strike in Iran. And 50, I think it was 54% supported it, right? So it was the same thing, kind of a majority, about twice as many who supported it as those who opposed it, and a large chunk who didn't know, which is very much what the picture looked like just a few weeks ahead of this current round, before support, shot up after the war began as a rallying effect. And you think, what was happening in 2018? Actually, there hadn't been a war, even with one of the, most kind of immediate threats to Israel, Hamas, and that's part of the Iran proxy network / Ring of Fire. There had not really been a serious escalation with Hamas at that point in 4 years. There had never been a war with Iran directly at that point. And in fact, it was, relatively speaking, kind of a quiet time. And it was even after a short, sort of 2 year roughly phase of kind of what we called individual lone wolf intifada, escalation and attacks, but from individuals between, among Palestinians in Jerusalem during 2015 and 16. And so 2018, it was exactly the kind of quiet period you're talking about. And yet you saw a moderate majority. I mean, a firm majority relative to those who were opposed, but only just over 50% who supported an attack, and yet a majority. So I think that reflects a very, very long-term consciousness that only military strategies can counter what Israelis view as an existential threat. Now, I want to be careful when I say Israelis view Iran as an existential threat. This is not hypothetical, right? Again, Hamas has been backed and funded in various ways by Iran, alongside, of course, Qatar over the years. And Hamas has fought, Israel has fought wars with Hamas, Hamas has fought wars with Israel, and has been firing on Israeli civilians, pretty much since the early 2000s. And October 7th, of course, was led by Hamas, but very much hoping to activate the entire so-called Ring of Fire or proxy network of Iran. And Hezbollah joined and the Houthis joined. And so this is not a theoretical threat. But nevertheless, there is, I think, much more of a psychological dimension of this conviction that only military force can deal with it. And that's certainly something that I think is very much, Netanyahu's well, you could say to Netanyahu's credit, or simply a success from his perspective, having convinced Israelis from the very beginning that the JCPOA signed under Barack Obama was bad from the start. In other words, it wasn't just, you know, trying to lobby to have America pull out of it, but from the moment it was even under consideration, even before it was signed, he went to Congress and told Americans that it was bad, which he did in the thick of an Israeli political campaign, probably as much intended for Israelis to know how dangerous and terrible it was to pursue diplomacy to try to contain this threat. In fact, he pursues diplomacy with nobody in terms of as a means to solve conflicts. Signing the Abraham Accords is a form of diplomacy, but there were no conflicts there to be resolved. So for
Right. Those
him,
are those
and
are were
Palestinians, you don't do
deepening ties
diplomacy.
with friendly Gulf states. I mean, it's a really distressing and uh, sort of harmful narrative that I think has successfully taken hold. Right. I mean, there's for example, the rhetoric of existential threat, right, which I think is meant to evoke the Holocaust and the idea of like wiping out the Israeli nation, which is in fact, from a security perspective, not what's like a real security threat is not the same as an existential threat, so-called, that can like wipe out a powerful country. But if you conflate those ideas in the body politic and in people's minds, and I mean, and this is very similar, I think, to the kind of rhetoric we saw in the U.S. after 9/11, where a horrible attack on the U.S. by a terrorist group was kind of presented as a strategic threat, as opposed to a real and significant threat, not a strategic threat in the sense that like a nuclear armed Russia, Soviet Union was a strategic threat to the United States. So there's been this, I think, a kind of long running conflation of types of threats, and it seems like it has effectively taken hold and become like the only way of understanding not just conflict, but like regional relations. So all that is a lead up to asking you, how, if at all, could Israel as a government, or Israelis as Jewish Israelis as a body of public opinion, go back to seeing diplomacy, politics, state-to-state relations as, if not the entirety of how to live within the region, as once again part of how to address the problem of the Iranian threat, for example, or the threat of Hamas that they face from Hamas or from Hezbollah and so on.
Well, let me just go back and say that when you say that September 11th was not the strategic threat in the way that a nuclear Russia might or nuclear Soviet Union might have been, for Israelis, they're thinking about a nuclear armed Iran as very much a strategic threat, not only the actual
Right, but
threat of having
there isn't
bombs thrown at
actually a
them.
nuclear armed Iran yet, right? I mean, that's
No, but they would
one of the
they
different,
see that
right?
if it would be right, but
Yes.
that's exactly the point. They think that if it would be, not only would there be a threat of Iran bombing the region, which I think is very low because they would kill millions of Palestinians, but they also, I think, primarily understand, at least at the political level, at the level of policy elites, and to some extent among the people as well, that a nuclear armed Iran would have no challengers and would be able to continue backing both the missile program and the proxies. And those are very immediate threats. In fact, even threat sounds too hypothetical. October 7th was real. And so, in the same way September 11th was real, if September 11th had been conducted by a nuclear armed power, would have been much harder to challenge that power afterwards. So they see it as a threat that is very much strategic in terms of the balance of power in the Middle East. So that's one thing. But in terms of how to contain that through diplomacy and can that attitude be changed? I mean, honestly, I think this is very much something that is leadership driven. And in a way, there has been a kind of legitimacy within Israel. There's almost no political legitimacy for anybody criticizing the war in Iran. Not a single Zionist or Jewish politician has wanted to do that, with the exception of Ofer Kasif, who's part of the Hadash party led by Ayman Odeh. It's a Jewish Arab traditional left-wing party. But for the most part, the major opposition parties, the Zionist parties, are absolutely not going to criticize
So
this
there's
war.
no significant mainstream opposition to the war.
No, not at all. With
And I guess that
93% support among the
93%
Jewish
figure, yeah.
population. Yeah. But the one thing that is sort of legitimate to say, and the leader of the Democrats party, Yair Golan, said it this morning in a radio interview, is that there must be a way to end these wars eventually through diplomatic gains. And that's a theme that was even legitimate to say during the entire post-October 7th phase with relation to Gaza, with relation to Palestinians, and especially after Israel reached a ceasefire with Lebanon in November 2024. There was quite a bit of conversation among very mainstream commentators and military experts and politicians about, well, if we can reach a ceasefire via diplomacy, even with Hezbollah and Lebanon, why can't we do that with relation to the Palestinians and Hamas in Gaza and end that war? And that was part of the mounting criticism against the ongoing war in Gaza. So it's not exactly an anti-war perspective, but it's more that there is a legitimate space for saying military achievements are incredibly important, and nobody's going to go against them. But if they don't end with diplomatic achievements, they will lay down the tracks for an ongoing cycle of military rounds, one after the other, every few years. And there's already a concern here that the whole mowing the grass concept that this government has developed, Netanyahu's government's developed years ago with relation to Hamas and Gaza, can somehow spread to Iran and through the Middle East. But all to say that if there is a different leader, right, or even if this current leader were suddenly to change his mind, which has happened before, I doubt at this point that Netanyahu would be the person to do it. But a leader who is legitimate, either because that leader was elected or in Israel elected, who were to take on the perspective and the worldview and argue for that worldview, that after all of this, of this military action over the last number of years, that now we need diplomacy to solidify whatever gains or achievements Israel made on the battlefield and ensure that there can be a future without permanent military cycles. That would be a legitimate thing to argue, and I think that a lot of the public would agree to it. You'll never get 100% of the public to agree to that. That's normal, right? But so far, we haven't seen anybody bold enough to really make the
And that's
case
right.
right
And at
now.
this point, that's like an almost entirely theoretical development in terms of politics. What's the appetite for? I mean, so it seems from what I'm hearing and reading from Israeli officials that that the plan in Lebanon is something like, once again, like an operation all the way to the Litani River. Some of the statements I've heard sound like a plan to indefinitely occupy a big chunk of Lebanon once again. is that a thing that Israelis support?
I don't have recent polling on it, but I don't think that Israelis generally want to undertake another long-term, indefinite occupation, boots on the ground, soldiers year after year in their mandatory service or in their reserve duty serving in Lebanon. People still have collective memories about how, that kind of bled the country over the years, for 18 years that Israel was sitting in southern Lebanon. So I wouldn't say it's terribly popular, but remember, this government doesn't always care about what's terribly popular. This government has undertaken policy after policy that violates the preferences of between 55 and 65% of the public on numerous issues. So this government really cares about its core, about its base, even as that base is not enough to give it a majority in polling right now. And so I wouldn't necessarily assume that it's going to follow what the public wants on this. Having said that, I think we have to be very cautious because there's, lots of rumors about the possibility for some diplomacy, with the Lebanese government right now as we're talking, and that's not entirely theoretical because we've had that diplomacy already in the past. Again, as recently as late 2024, for all the criticism of that ceasefire and how many times it was broken. Nevertheless, I think there are significant signals that Israel could just as easily well, maybe not, maybe it wouldn't be easy, but there's a sort of a detailed plan that is being presented now as part of the French initiative that might lead to something more stable that would involve Israel gradually withdrawing not only its forces in southern Lebanon right now, but also the five specific positions that it's currently holding, which it's been there, ever since the ceasefire. And so both of those paths are possible right now. I should also say there's kind of a third path, which is, driven by religious fanatic, fundamentalists in the Israeli government who want to essentially start the long messianic process of putting the army there, staying there, and eventually trying to, argue that it's part of Israel and build little outposts that turn into settlements. Now that seems like a wild fantasy, but there are
Right.
individuals who
So
are pushing in that direction, and so we can't entirely discount that because they're advocating for the same thing in Gaza.
so I mean, I don't know if this is a question you can answer, but uh, we've been watching this particular cycle of Israeli wars with in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Lebanon, now Iran, also with the Houthis, strikes on Iraq, strikes in Syria, and one, my view from spending my entire adult life studying the forever wars is that uh, force simply can't resolve these types of security dilemmas, right? It's part of it, and it definitely is nowhere close to the entirety of it, right? You can't address a problem like Iraq's militias, Iran's ayatollahs, Hezbollah, whatever. You can't resolve it by force, and we keep seeing that in examples like the strikes last summer on Iran, which supposedly were so effective, and then within months it turns out they weren't as effective as Israel and the U.S. government said they were. Same with the war in Lebanon, right? I mean, after a really unbelievable amount of firepower dropped on Lebanon, the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, the occupation of five new strategic hilltops in South Lebanon. So all these measures are taken, including ongoing strikes during the ceasefire, and yet it turns out that wasn't sufficient to contain Hezbollah. Like under those extreme conditions, which themselves are I think wrong and problematic, but they were being done with the supposition that this kind of punishing forward extreme military posture would, at least from Israel's perspective, successfully weaken Hezbollah or contain it. And it turns out under that pressure, Hezbollah rebuilt its missile structure and is now firing missiles every day into northern Israel. So I wonder, I mean, to the extent you have insight into this, do Israelis, whether at the official level or the public opinion level, have they started to process that this strategy mowing the lawn, as it's sort of dehumanizingly called, but the strategy of just like managing adversaries by constantly being at war with them doesn't actually accomplish its core aim.
The answer is yes, but I think that the solution that many Israelis give, certainly in the mainstream and mainstream leaning right, which is kind of synonymous with mainstream, is that it simply hasn't gone far enough. That the strategy should not be a matter of mowing the lawn, but that uprooting the roots of, an
Tearing
organization
up the
like
lawn,
Hezbollah,
burning the
tearing it
lawn.
up. Right. Now, I think that the response to that is that that's not possible. There is no real way to do that. And there are people making that case, including in mainstream commentators, among mainstream commentators and security experts. It's a legitimate conversation. It's just that the other end of the conversation is that, well, if that's not really possible to completely uproot an organization like Hamas and uproot every weapon that they have, then that means that you'll have to get to a diplomatic arrangement, which then, is the riposte is always, but we've had diplomatic arrangements. We've tried that and it doesn't work. For example, I think the biggest, theme that I hear with relation to Hezbollah in Lebanon is 1701. Now, I have to say
That's the
that's
UN
the UN
security for
Security
our
Council
listeners.
resolution that ended the war in 2006. And in fact, it was, by my assessment, it was pretty successful because actually that was a pretty quiet border. It's not a a final international border, but boundary for all of those years from 2006 pretty much until October 8th, 2023. And this really does raise the question of like, I mean, Hezbollah made that decision to join this, this campaign, whatever you want to call it, of Hamas, this attack. And so I don't think there's one good answer to it, but I will say that in this very hostile region, highly militarized region, lasting for from 2006, for basically almost, not, I mean, we're talking about 17 years of relative quiet. I would call that rather a success for the diplomacy based on the UN Security Council resolution. And I think that Israelis were aware of it too at the policy level because they knew there had been these kinds of what they called the unwritten rules or the unwritten red lines between the understandings, the silent understandings between Hezbollah and the Israelis about what was and wasn't to be done. And so you think why doesn't the Israeli public or other policymakers realize that? And that's because the current government is simply not willing to look at it like that, doesn't want to portray it like that, is manipulative about it, and instead has tried to continue with the theme that there can be some all out military assault, but it's never, and it's really just a moving target because the military assault against Hezbollah in response was very extreme. And, the government talked with big bluster about how much it had incapacitated Hezbollah and, of course, assassinated, decapitated its leaders and decapitated numerous layers of the chain of command. And yet here we are. And the, people in the north now are furious because as much as it's unpleasant here in Tel Aviv, and we have, I would say 3 to 7 rocket barrages, missile barrages every day, in every 24-hour span, it's a lot more in the north, and they feel like they've been lied to. And so they're saying, but
Well,
the
they
only
have been,
conclusion
right? They
they're
have
going
been
to,
lied to,
yes,
and it's the same, by the way, the same lie that the Pentagon is telling the U.S. public, which is, sort of similar narrative. Uh, we haven't hit the world hard enough. That's the
right,
real
right,
problem with the forever war strategy is that it was a half measure, and now we're going
right.
to see what real firepower can accomplish. And of course, what we'll find is what it can't accomplish is getting Iran to do what America and Israel wanted to do, or creating a Lebanon that acts exactly the way America and Israel wanted to act. Like these are things that can't be done by force. And I mean, as someone who opposes this sort of reckless war of choice, I'm also sanguine about the limits of diplomacy, right? Like we support uh, political and diplomatic approaches to these conflicts without pretending that those will sort of bring about a kumbaya resolution that's entirely satisfactory, right? It's not that I'm not arguing that politics and diplomacy would bring a perfect solution, and if only we were willing to do that, we wouldn't have any problems. I just am unfortunately being proven right that the path of maximalist war is just far worse, right? So when we're
Well, I
choosing
mean, I agree.
between,
I think that there's been, a real manipulative kind of conversation, both in, in the American, but primarily driven by the Republican circles, and in Israel in the right wing, which is that if we just acted, very aggressively, the world would be a perfectly peaceful place. That's,
at
I mean,
least for us, right?
any child knows that that's not correct. I don't know any place in the world that has achieved perfect security with no crime, never, nothing. I mean, there's no place in the world that lives like that. And so selling people on the idea that if you just bomb harder, you will uproot, every stone, every knife, every bomb, every missile, which really, literally, you hear Israelis saying, I mean, if we have to get rid of every single gun that Hezbollah holds, it's not possible. America is awash in guns, and, South Africa is awash in crime. There is no perfect society. But I do think that selling people on the idea of permanent war, the theme has been, or the way people are convinced of this is that they say, well, if that's what will keep me secure, we have to do it. Whereas I say 17 years of uncertain, insecure, and yet fairly quiet border with no casualties and no displacements is better than ongoing cycles of war where the North right now, sovereign Israeli territory, is fundamentally almost uninhabitable.
So yeah, and I mean the idea of permanent war in a Praetorian society, I think, has completely taken root among Jewish Israelis, among Hezbollah partisans, among partisans of the regime in Iran. I mean, there are in all the Middle Eastern societies that I know well. I wouldn't say it's like a universal value, but it's a plurality, a very important plurality in almost every one of these societies: Iran, Iraq, um, Syria to a lesser degree right now, but to a significant degree, Shia communities in Lebanon and so on. These ideas are deeply held that if you aren't, in Israel, I don't know what the sort of ideological frame for it is in uh, Iran's axis. It's the ideology of resistance, and it's a mirrored idea, right? It's that if you aren't fighting, you're being destroyed. And there is, I think, there's come to be a positive value placed on being permanently at war. It's in some discourse that's viewed as a sort of hyper masculine or a hyper justice based position, and it's very self reinforcing because if you aren't eradicated, you've won by this kind of framing, and so you have multiple societies that have set themselves up to be in a sort of unwinnable conflicts, which they can spin to themselves as repeated victories. I mean, it's been crazy to hear Hamas members. I mean, I interviewed a Hamas official in Doha in December who knows how genuine this was, but he was spinning the survival of Hamas in Gaza as a victory. And a Palestinian journalist I was with, this wasn't a public interview, was outraged, and he said, "Look what's happened to our people. How can you call this a victory?" And the Hamas official sort of condescendingly said to him, "Sorry, I don't know why my doorbell is ringing. What a weird interruption on a Sunday morning." Um, so the this official said, very condescendingly said, now, you're too young to understand how generational struggles work. By surviving, we have won. And one of the things I took from that is like, good Lord, like you it's very hard to break out of a conflict dynamic in which many of the major parties, and I would say a similar mindset exists in the Israeli leadership, right? And it becomes irreconcilable to normal normal security formulations that would if not end, at least reduce these kinds of conflicts. Sorry for that
Okay, so
long
there's no that's
soliloquy.
there's a lot in there. I mean, I had just recently wrote an article about these about shifts in Palestinian thinking about the Palestinian National Project, and at the risk of wanting to speak for Palestinians, I do not want to do that, but I did interview or draw on the writing of some very prominent Palestinians who are absolutely of a different generation. In other words, I don't buy that it's a generational thing. Some of these were elder statesmen of the Palestinian national movement in their, influence, and said that the Palestinian national movement has frankly failed Palestinians, under this mindset that it has to be a permanent war and the survival of these, particularly the kind of decrepit two-party or two movements that lead the Palestinians right now, and they have to rethink that. So that's, I think, part of the conversation that's being had in Palestinian society. I will say that from what I hear of Iranian analysts and insider observers of Iran, that's very much how they characterize the regime there as well. That the Islamic Republic is basically saying, to hell with what happens physically to our country, as long as we, the regime, survive, that's victory. And in terms of Israelis, I mean, I do think that Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, absolutely has an ideology of staying in power. It's one of his three core ideologies that has been with him for almost his entire political life. One is staying in power. The other is getting rallying the world to attack Iran militarily, contain Iran militarily, and the third is preventing Palestinian self-determination anywhere between,
Oh, so
river.
he's succeeded in all three of his core aims, huh?
Well, true, and I would say that they differ. He sort of they rotate in terms of which is the most prominent. So there's no question that he has an ideology personally of staying in power. I will say that the tragic reality is that Palestinians have become habituated over decades to a much more destructive way of life. I mean, Israel, the escalations and wars mean that Israel regularly razes Gaza practically to the ground, at least certain neighborhoods. And in the West Bank, people have become habituated to what is, a substandard way of living with movement restrictions and, devastated
They've
economic life in most
adapted to
places.
this long-term cycle of wars and
What I'm saying is
occupation.
that people become habituated to the worst of conditions. Now, Israelis are not used to that. And so, I think one of the questions many of us are asking is like, will this become the new reality? Because right now, and certainly in June, after 12 days, just 12 days of running up and down into shelters all the time, and much of the economic life being shut down, and schools having to either study remotely but we all know how limited that is, right, from the Corona years. Now we've been in this, I think we're on the 16th day. People are zombies, right? And we're not used to this. And so I think on the one hand, there's still a sense that Israel can't live like this forever. We're not used to living like this. We don't know what it is to kind of not feel comfortable. I went to a different city for the first time in 2 weeks on Friday because people aren't leaving their neighborhoods. Just we're afraid to be away from a shelter or too far from a shelter, or we don't know where the nearest shelter is going to be. Um, like that is such a huge rupture from the way Israelis have been living all these years. And on the other hand, okay, what you'll see among a lot of the Israeli conversation is a sort of self-congratulatory sense of how resilient Israelis are and how they're, rallying and being supportive in the communities and in the shelters. People are nice to each other and, have set up games and coffee and for kids, stuff that for kids to do and take their dogs. And there's a great community feeling. And that Israelis are flocking back from abroad because only Israelis want to go home in a time of war rather than fleeing. Well, all of that is, I think, because Israel has tried to find a way to establish an infrastructure that makes war livable, which is good for the emergency situation. I mean, I'm happy there's shelters, but not good in a way if it makes us think that we can live like this permanently. So I think there is a real dilemma, and I think that Israelis are asking themselves, is this going to be our new reality? Can we get used to this? We all know that, a huge number of people have left the country over the last couple of years. We don't know if they'll leave permanently, but they're mostly people with, well, many, we understand that a lot of them are people who have the opportunity, right? They're higher educated, work in, internationally mobile jobs, and that's going to mean a brain drain. Some numbers that are being thrown around are over 200,000 people have left. There was a number of like 80,000 people from the high tech sector. It's hard to verify some of this stuff, but these are, coming from fairly credible sources. And so, the longer term future of living in this permanent state of war is certainly a big question I think Israelis are really asking themselves after 2.5 years. And each time they think there's a ceasefire, each time they think that this phase is starting to be behind us. Most recently from the October ceasefire with between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, I think Israelis really many of them felt, without looking at how much Israel was constantly striking in Gaza, just said to themselves, oh, finally, this nightmare is beginning to end. And now they're realizing that, guess what? The wars aren't over. So there are mixed feelings, and I don't have a great way to reconcile those, but I think those are all very serious questions that are plaguing Israelis right now, and
Yeah, and
including
I
in
mean,
this
and it's
underslept and agitated state.
and it sounds from your analysis that the sort of policy direction is clear, which is positioning the Israeli state for this kind of permanent war, right? Whether uh, how people are processing that is what you were just describing, but it sounds like the infrastructure is clearly this, right? And it's we already in the mowing the lawn era, it was already something approaching permanent war. And what we're seeing now, certainly vis-a-vis Lebanon, vis-a-vis Gaza, vis-a-vis the West Bank, is because I mean the ceasefires that we saw were what traditional political scientists would consider a state of war. They weren't ceasefires in any technical sense. So I think it's a bleak prognosis, and really, I mean, we're not in the business of prognosticating here. We're describing today's reality as we understand it, and I think that the the sort of structural factors are lend themselves to a paradigm of what I've been calling forever war, and I think that's reinforced by U.S. policy, right? And we haven't this conversation hasn't been about U.S. policy, but the uh, the mindset of Israel's leadership has found a strong harmonization in Trump's policy, which I think he's trying to figure out how to manage the political fallout from a war that's been much costlier than he expected. But I think he likes this approach too, right? The sort of smash a hornet's nest over and over as a way of managing world affairs and projecting power.
Well, he has used the word fun several times when talking about some of the military
Talk
operations,
about
but I think that in Israel, I would say I would be a little cautious about that. I know there are a number of analysts who think that exactly what you just said, that Netanyahu and this government are laying the groundwork for cycles and cycles of hot wars, throughout the Middle East. I am not entirely sure, because I wouldn't necessarily assume it's all that strategic. I think the original plan A was absolutely driven by, completely inflated by hubris, that Israel and America together can re-engineer the politics of Iran and can re-engineer the politics of Lebanon. Never mind how many times they failed at trying to do that in Lebanon. But I think that nevertheless, there's the kind of God complex that this amazing partnership together could help completely redesign those countries in the image of what America and Israel want, and that it would not lead to the scenario of permanent wars, but more like these will be wonderful, compliant, cooperative, Abraham Accord loving countries after we're done with them, because we will simply install the kinds of regimes that we want, or not even install them. Let's say that's the language of a different era, but we will create the conditions, is the latest euphemism that Benjamin Netanyahu has been saying. And so, if that had gone according to plan, and we know there was something like a plan because both of them, I mean, or at least expectations, both of those leaders
Yeah, I
were
would say
openly
it's
talking about regime change.
fantasy more than plan. I mean, but yes, you're right.
Maybe.
There was a
Well,
belief this could happen. I don't think there was what we would think of as a traditional plan. I mean,
I would say there were certainly components intended to topple the regime without a plan for what to do next. So I don't think there was a plan to install a new Shah, but there definitely were efforts made, I think, in the strategic and military planning to help topple the regime. I mean, they've said it quite openly, and you can see from the efforts to assassinate at various levels of the Islamic Republic, and to try to undermine Basaj as much as possible. Like they're definitely they want that to happen. They say it openly, and they've tried. And I think that there was a hope that it would happen. The kind of that the military operation would take the situation so far, and that very quickly the rest of it would kick in, the regime would fall, Iran would topple. It would be like, dominoes, first Syria, then Iran, then somehow Lebanon as well, right? Magically. And maybe you're right. I mean, it's hard to say whether it was a plan or an expectation
In
or
any
like
case,
steps intended.
it's an idea that is not only it's a terrible idea in my view, it's also an impossible fantasy. So Dahlia, I think we have to leave it there. This has been a really great, useful conversation, and I hope it can help our listeners contextualize over the week to come. What are some of the factors shaping this conflict as we try to imagine off ramps or ends to it? This analysis that you shared with us, I think, is really going to help us understand what better outcomes might be possible and what worse outcomes are likely. I've been talking to Dahlia Scheindlin in Tel Aviv. I'm Thanasi Kambanis, Director of Century International. Dahlia, thank you so much for making the time to talk to us on this Sunday afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Order from Athens, a production of Century International and the Century Foundation. I'm Thanasi Kambanis, Director of Century International, and thanks for listening this far. If you stayed with us this long, we'll talk to you again same time next week.